Hello, everyone, and welcome to WhatsApp, a space for progressive Asian American voices. I'm your co-host, Albert Kachapum, alongside Ji Young Park. Welcome to episode 2. Today, here's WhatsApp, becoming an activist. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Claire Lau, who is the co-founder of SF Berniecrats, and so much more. I'm very excited to have her on board because all of the work that she's done in the progressive community in San Francisco. We did have an icebreaker question similar to last episode. What is your favorite food from the culture you identify with? And you can also talk a little bit about your background if you'd like here too.
So this is actually a very difficult question for me because I love food, and I'd say I identify with multiple cultures because I was actually born in France and I lived there until I was 7, and then I grew up in Hong Kong for the rest of until I was 18, and I love eating, so there are lots of foods that I love, but I would say for French. Almond croissants definitely have those cravings. And then for Hong Kong, foods, I think that radish cakes are one of the things I crave, and I've tried to make my own because it takes forever, but it's also I'm not always happy with the way that it's made, and it's harder to find good quality ones. And of course, I love dim sum too, all sorts of dim sum. But I'll go with radish cake, which is actually a specialty during the Lunar New Year. And so that's usually when you are able to get radish cake, and it's like a 3-hour process because you have to cook it and then steam it.
I love radish cake, but I can never have it because it usually has pork. And so if there are any places that have radish cake without pork, I would love to know where that is.
Which is actually one of the reasons, I do eat pork, but one of the reasons I started making my own is that I can choose exactly what I put in it. And my husband doesn't really like dried stuff because usually it's got dried sausage and dried shrimp and dried scallops. And he doesn't like that stuff. So I would make it from scratch and use other fresh ingredients.
Awesome.
And fresh shiitake mushrooms. And
sounds amazing. So I'm just wondering what SF Berniecrats is.
Sure. So the SF Berniecrats was founded right after the June 2016 primary in California. I co-founded the San Francisco Berniecrats. I think July of 2016 was when we had our first meeting drafting our bylaws. And then the next meeting, we voted on our name. And the name was democratically voted on. And so the idea was, elections, this election has ended, but there's more organizing to do. We need to continue the movement. We need to plug into local politics, understand what's going on locally. We need to be building coalitions because in 2016, I felt there was this Bernie bro sort of narrative of the movement being led by white guys, which I think was an exaggeration. Not that they didn't exist at all, but, the movement was more diverse than what the Democratic Party would make it seem like. But at the same time, there's a lot more work to be done to reach out to different communities of color. And so this was, I thought a great opportunity to start building coalitions. So that's why I co-founded the San Francisco Berniecrats. And that led to a lot more other things.
What motivated you to even start in the first place?
Yeah, so I had always been politically aware. So my parents had brought me to protests since I was very young. I actually went to my first march before I turned 1 8-year-old. That was in 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre. And my parents actually brought me to a march. I don't remember it at all, but my dad keeps telling me the story. And when we moved back to Hong Kong, we would attend yearly vigils in commemoration of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which is, the only place in, you could say, Chinese soil where that is a gathering like that is legal. In China, it's very much censored. Any mention of Tiananmen Square is censored. And so I kind of grew up being more or less politically aware. In middle school, I think was when the war with Iraq began, the U.S. was threatening to go to war with Iraq. And I actually started writing a letter from my middle school to the Bush administration. And I had the idea, talked to a friend, and then a bunch of people wanted to get in on it. And I think we ended up writing a pretty bad letter because each person wrote a paragraph and it was like not a very well written letter. But we wrote it like kind of on behalf of the class and sent it to the White House. We never heard a response against the war in Iraq. And then at the same time, I became a lot more acutely aware of the environmental degradation that was happening around me. The air pollution was horrible in Hong Kong, mostly from industries blowing the air down to, from southern China down to Hong Kong. And I just witnessed myself forested hills near my neighborhood being completely cut down so that highways could be built. And so that was just like a very personal experience. Like I would, be standing next to the woods waiting for the bus. And then a few years later, like that entire area was just gone. And it was all concrete. And so I think that made me aware of the human impact on the environment. And so I started actually doing artwork about that theme, about environmentalism. Like my high school art show theme was about, environmentalism. And then when I went to Massachusetts for college, my first spring break, I went with my then boyfriend, now husband, traveled down to DC to march against the war in Iraq because it was still going on then. And so I'd been more of like a, participant and definitely had political views. But it wasn't until, Bernie's run in 2015 that I started actually organizing things. And that kind of one thing led to another, and it pulled me deeper and deeper into politics. So I actually started by organizing or co-organizing these disco dance parties called Burn Baby Burn with my husband, who was DJing at the time. There was very little going on in San Francisco, and we wanted to get people excited about Bernie. And so the first time we organized Burn Baby Burn, we thought there may be 50 people who would show up, but we ended up having 400 or 500 people show up with lines around the block. So we ended up organizing them once a month, and then later on twice a month. And I started signing people up to phone bank. Later, when the campaign finally came to California, started tabling and organizing canvases in my neighborhood. And we met so many wonderful people who were working really, really hard on the Bernie campaign. And after he lost the California primary, I thought that it would be such a shame to just let all of this energy disintegrate and go to waste. And that's when I had the idea of forming the San Francisco Berniecrats to continue the organizing locally. And so after I formed the SF Berniecrats, I started going to lots of different political club events, meeting different people. And Jane Kim actually in summer of 2017 invited me to work in her legislative office as a legislative aide during the summer while her chief of staff was taking a break. And so I worked there for 2 months. I decided at that time that it wasn't really a lifestyle for me because you just work constantly, there's no real break. And I was like, I still like to be doing my art. I'd been teaching and working on my art for many years by then. And I was like, I think I still want to go back to that. But then by the end of that year, San Francisco late mayor Ed Lee passed away, and Jane decided to run for mayor. So I became like the first hire onto her campaign, worked on her campaign for the June election, and then I became the campaign manager for a local supervisor candidate in San Francisco, Tony Kelly. And then after that, I was like, okay, this has been a grueling year. 2018 was so grueling. I gotta take a break. I, took a long break, traveled to Europe with my husband, got unplugged a little bit, went back to teaching and art. And then lo and behold, like, I think 3 months later, Bernie announced he was running again. And I was at first like I didn't want to work on the campaign because I was like, I still need a break from working on campaigns. And Jane had been asking me like whether I wanted to work on the campaign. But in the end, there were 2 people who really influenced my decision to work on the campaign. One was my mother, who in 2016 actually, my parents still live in Hong Kong, and she was like, well, Hillary Clinton has more international experience, and they don't really, follow U.S. politics very closely. So they're like, oh, we see her on TV all the time. She's has a lot of international experience. But by 2019, my mom was like, oh my goodness, like I've seen how destructive Trump is to this world, like this entire world. We have to have a world leader that, puts us on the right path and sets an example. And so my mom was like, if you work on the Bernie campaign, that's not only a contribution to, the U.S., but it's also a contribution to the entire existence of this planet and this world. And then, so that was like, heavy. And then the other person was a union organizer who basically was like, Claire, you've been doing this work. Like, if you don't do this work and they happen to hire some white dude who doesn't know what he's doing, you're going to end up like picking up the slack and doing the work anyway. And you're going to be frustrated and you're going to work, twice as hard to compensate, and you're not going to get paid for it. So you should really just work on the campaign. And so
that's some really good advice. I love that.
and she was like, women of color often do the work, but don't get credited for it, And so she's like, if you're going to do the work, you might as well get paid for it and actually, do it in an official capacity. So I was like, okay, I'll do it. So I joined. So yeah, then I joined the Bernie 2020 campaign in the summer of 2019 and acted first as the Bay Area field director and then got promoted to Bay Area director. And then after we won California, got redeployed to New York to be the deputy state director for New York. But that lasted about a month before the campaign had to fold.
What we all have in common is that we all worked on the Bernie campaign this last go around.
To Ji-Young's point, Bernie definitely had a good impact, and so yeah, hopefully he inspires other people of all types of political interests to really stand up. I mean, it's kind of funny because even right now, Trump himself is saying Republicans need to pass this $2,000 thing, and you have people like Mitch McConnell that are still pushing against this. Any thoughts about that?
Oh, I think it's great to see, what people consider the far left and far right, working together on the same issue,
Right.
which I think is a false binary. Like, I don't think things are a left-right continuum. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But it's great to see, what people think are the polar opposite, Bernie Sanders, the squad, working with Trump to get $2,000 checks to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, to your point though, Claire, that's so true about like the left and right continuum being a false dichotomy, because I would say and argue strongly that in San Francisco, the left here, like the establishment left, pretty much acts like Republicans in terms of not their progressive values, but like in terms of like, and when I say progressive values, I'm talking about like LGBTQ and etc. Well, I'm talking about like when it comes to NIMBYness, houselessness, and all that stuff. Like they basically all side with the developers and tech industry, right? I mean, I don't know. I don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, San Francisco is like socially very liberal, but when it actually comes to economic policies or policies that affect money, then you can see that there's still like a very stark difference. And actually, even the NIMBY YIMBY conversation, I feel like can be a false dichotomy too. I feel like just because one side is saying, no, don't build, we like to preserve the character. And then the other side is saying like, yes, build, deregulate. It's like, no, hold on a second. Like we can't solve this problem by building, but being conscious of what we're building and actually serve, the underserved populations and not building more for, luxury developers, so.
Yeah, and I think, Jian, you might have some history with this or experience, because that NIMBY, like yes in my backyard, not in my backyard discussion, really blew up in K-Town in Los Angeles, where the people like realized the residents there overnight that they were building a homeless shelter there, and people like community members were up in arms. And I think the whole argument there was that we weren't solicited about this placement. And so, I mean, I think, yeah, it's definitely, to Claire's point, the need to include the community rather than just go in with guns ablazing and like, we're going to develop.
It's we have to be intentional about everything. We have, the world is there's climate change, so much houselessness. From this point on, we have to be intentional about housing people, about changing our ways so that the environment isn't impacted in the way it is. And being intentional requires everyone to be on the same page. It shouldn't be like a dichotomy.
Yeah, and I think the other point of the dichotomy too is that, unfortunately, I'm going to use Bernie Sanders' quote here with the 1%. Unfortunately, I think the 1% get a lot more weight because of either lobbyists or whatever, or even media. I mean, honestly, a lot of times local media really favors, I want to say, like, quote unquote, establishment narratives much more than our kind of progressive agenda and voices to include others. So I don't know if you
San Francisco is definitely like that. The SF Chronicle likes to often side with the establishment. So
I mean, LA Times too. But I'm also thinking in terms of like the native language newspapers. And that's one thing I've noticed a lot with slander but I don't know.
Oh, there's a lot of people a lot of non-English speakers get their news from alternative news sources like YouTube and
or WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Or
WeChat and Kakao Talk for Koreans. And it's like there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
With Chinese media in the Bay Area, I think that they're I think it's a little bit more complex, although in general, I think there is, a tendency to side with the establishment. But I think more than anything else, they want to see that you're actually reaching out to the Chinese community before they report on you. So, in the campaigns that I've worked on, when I have been actively early reaching out to the Chinese media publications, Singtao World Journal, they tend to report on our things. When I place ads with them, they're like, oh, you actually want to reach out to our community, so they also tend to then, cover our things more. And so I think it's a more long-term relationship, and actually something that I think progressives need to do more is, build the connections, reach out to the community, build that relationship earlier on, and not just wait until like last minute, ballots drop, in a few weeks. Oh crap, we don't have the Chinese vote, because the Chinese vote in San Francisco is like 30% of the population. So if you want to win, you really have to reach out to the Chinese voters, and that requires work.
I'm struggling actually right now to reach out to the Chinese voters in my assembly district, where I'm running as an assembly district delegate for the Democratic Party, and I'm trying to get an organization to translate, and I'm actually having a hard time identifying one. And
we should talk.
Okay. let's do that.
But starting with, language materials. And that's the tricky thing about the API vote, too, is that there are so many languages. So if you want to reach out comprehensively to the API community, especially in a place like LA, where, there are so many different groups, like San Francisco proper itself, it's mostly Chinese, but, there are other groups, too. But LA is like, it's much more diverse in terms of like the language needs there. So, you got to translate, and then you have to be culturally competent. You can't just write something in English and translate it into another language and expect it to work well, because I've seen other campaigns do that and it doesn't work well. So you need to like find people who know the community to help you write, the platform and think about how to message.
Not only that, the application to request a mail-in ballot is only in English. So even if we get the message out about this election, we still need people to help non-English speakers to actually request the mail-in ballot and fill out the ballot. Yeah. It's pretty insane.
This is for the ADEM election, right?
Correct.
Yeah, the Democratic Party needs to really improve on language access.
I mean, I would actually even argue, Claire, that part of this is intentional to maybe keep people. I don't want to say they're malicious, but I mean, considering what happened to Bernie,
there's also a lot of incompetence.
There's like definitely there could be a lot of improvement to actually make the Democratic Party more democratic.
Definitely.
I think engaging people early on is a surefire way to make sure that people are included in the communities that we reach out to. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just say, when we engage, we also, to Jiyoung's point, like have to be very intentional in how we engage, because I know, like, I've actually been recently in discussions with leftists here they have a certain worldview and they have a hard time, being in other people's shoes. And so for a lot of, API folks, especially like first generation immigrants, they tend to be culturally a lot more conservative. And so they fall very easily to the more conservative tendencies and narratives. And there are some, more prominent figures that are more conservative, and they tend to be swayed that way. And when leftists, enter into that conversation, we have to be cognizant of the background they are coming from. Like if you talk about healthcare, I would venture to say that most API folks support government-run healthcare system for everyone. But if you're like socialism, communism, blah, blah, they're going to be scared and they're not going to listen to you. And so we have to be intentional when we discuss the issues and really like stick to the issues and talk about them in a way that the community will understand and come to our side.
That's absolutely right. I mean, we can see that the messaging is so critical and has to be tailored to each specific community, not just AAPIs, but
Absolutely.
each community, each different AAPI community. And yes, actually, there has been a study done which did find that amongst AAPIs, most AAPIs do want universal health care.
And education, I think
that was second. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think one important thing in terms of intention is for any community that we talk about is, and Jiyoung, you talked about this in the last episode. How do we distill it so that these are the policies that work best for everybody, not just the 1% or not just the elite people with lobbyists?
I mean, ultimately, I think people want to know how it affects them.
Right.
So when you bring it home, like. When you can connect with their personal experience of healthcare, of education, or of losing a home, like then you can really, attach that to the policy. And then once you are in agreement with the policy, then you can say, well, this is the candidate that is pushing for this policy. But if you go in, with the candidate, then it's just becomes like personality contest, and people really don't like that for the most part.
Yep. 100%. And I think that's where establishment candidates kind of shine because they can kind of polish up whatever personality that they want to share. And
Buttigieg is a concert pianist. I don't care. I play the piano. I love music. I don't care that my president is a concert pianist.
That's a whole other issue. But I mean, it really comes down to substance and policies that affect people, I think. So
yeah, I mean, Bernie Sanders is just another old white man.
True.
So the only way that people could get on board was to talk about his policies. Otherwise, why does anybody want yet another really old white man? But yeah, again, like when I was canvassing, there were people who didn't know who Bernie was. And when I went to their door, they literally did not know the other candidates. And I asked them to vote for Bernie, and they voted for Bernie.
This is in 2020, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
In San Francisco, the Chinese neighborhoods all went for Bernie. Like Sunset, Richmond, Chinatown. I mean, it took work to get there. Like we canvassed those areas heavily. I think we were the first campaign to have materials in all these languages and actually help lead the translation for Chinese and worked with Jane on some other API languages. But yeah.
Can I say a quick follow-up to that in the sense that when I was following closely Jane Kim's mayoral election, it was the opposite, right? I mean, I felt like the Chinese community went not for Jane at all in her mayoral campaign, but that kind of was really similar to what happened in California in 2016 with Bernie Sanders and California in 2020. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little different because I think in 2016 the campaign just didn't do any outreach to the API, and like in 2016 the campaign had no materials in any API languages. Like all the stuff that I came across were self-produced.
Oh, yeah,
like
that's
it
true.
wasn't
Yeah.
official campaign materials. But 2020, like the official campaign actually printed, like we made sure that the official campaign reached out, had materials in different languages. But I think with Jane, it was more of the slander from the Senate race, the residue from that. And it's not that the Jane hasn't been building a relationship with the Chinese community. She has a really long history of, being involved in the Chinese community, and her campaign definitely reached out.
I see.
And she had some support too. She won the Richmond. There are areas where she won, but there was just some really nasty sexist slander, fabricated, personal slander that happened in her state Senate race. That was really just unfair.
Yeah, and that was translated, I believe, too.
That was just released in Chinese media. It was people in the English-speaking world didn't even know about it until much later, because it was fabricated to be spread among, the Chinese community.
So what does SF Berniecrats do now?
Right now, we have a range of things. We, currently folks are busy with the ADEM elections, that you're running for here in San Francisco. We have some members who are running. So people are organizing for that. Let's see. People are getting excited about Delane Easton's run for party chair. And then we have a healthcare committee. I've been actually wanting to work in coalition with API organizations to reach out more to the Chinese and API community in San Francisco, particularly around the issues of safety, because that is one of the issue of highest concerns in San Francisco within the API community. And I think that, again, there's a bit of a false dichotomy here too, where, leftists are like, anyone who is concerned about safety is just like upholding the police, state and, the criminal justice system. And then of course, there are actually the people who are, who want increased police presence. And so we have to basically figure out, how do we make the community safer without increasing policing? Because, crime there's a lot to the root cause of crime. And of course, it's not going to be solved like overnight. But how do we engage the community in that conversation? And how do we also show we care about the community? Because a lot of the Chinese community, there have been some like high profile assaults on elderly Chinese people in San Francisco. And, it's really shocked the community. And so how do we, show that we actually care about them and we want to do something for the well-being of the community, and not just say like, because we can try to build a stronger community without increasing policing. So, just want to, I've been interested in getting more engaged in those efforts.
To that note,
Funny that you say that, because I actually recently was on a neighborhood call that a neighborhood council member organized, and she invited the police, but no organizations, no like housing organizations. And so I called her out for that and said, why are we only talking to the police here? But I also felt really bad for the people whose homes were being broken into, or, had stuff stolen from their garages, their mail stolen. But I really didn't know
where to direct these people, other than this one directory of services. But there should be more local services to prevent the crime, I think. And so, yeah,
and to support victims.
And to support victims. And I challenged these people to spend as much time talking to their leaders, council members and the mayor's office, to talk about the root causes of this small property crime, to cancel rent, etc. As much as they're spending time complaining about all this stuff. So yeah, it's really a struggle, this like transition time between like calling for defunding and then actually creating the infrastructure for alternatives to policing.
Yeah.
One thing I just wanted to add is another personal plug for myself is that I did work on the hate crime map, which also helped to map AAPI crimes during COVID, to really bring to forefront that a lot of racism is occurring due to COVID-19 as well. So that's something that it's not necessarily property per se, but it is definitely crimes that are very, very disturbing. I would say even more disturbing. I mean, yeah, losing property is important. Like, you have to survive. But I would say like the emotional damage being done to people of like, in our communities.
And part of the discussion that I've been having with folks too is, there has been a lot of hate crime. And some people are saying, well, actually, if you look at hate crime statistics, hasn't necessarily gone up within San Francisco. It has gone up like elsewhere, I know for a fact, but in San Francisco, it hasn't necessarily gone up. But then when you look at hate crime is like has a very narrow definition.
Yes,
and what we found in San Francisco is that there have been, elderly API folks who've been targeted not for hate crime, but they've just been, I think 2 years ago, there was a, 80-something-year-old grandma who was like beaten to a pulp and found next to a trash can by her family who, after she disappeared for a while, and she was robbed, all of her valuables were gone. So it's not necessarily a hate crime, but it was like horrible because she was found like unconscious, with her face covered in blood, and that was really shocking to the community. And so, there's like hate crime and there's just being targets of
right.
crime in general.
Yeah, but these particular ones are literally like, go back to China, you gave us the flu, or this thing. These are like very, and these people aren't even Chinese, like they get reports.
Okay.
And so
my incident is on there.
Oh yes, that's right, Jiyoung. I would say that the main point of that kind of endeavor is to say that one hate crime is too many, in a sense that we should not be in a society that allows any of this to occur.
Yep.
So I mean that's a different issue, but I did want to flag that as another kind of like crime that should also be part of like protecting the people. So anyways, probably jump down to the question now of how do you avoid burning out with your levels of activism and how do you sustain that?
Yeah, it's hard. I won't lie. I've definitely taken breaks after campaigns just because it's so grueling and exhausting, and you're working like 80, 100 hours a week, and you don't have time to exercise or cook yourself a nice meal. And so I definitely take some time off usually after really intense long periods of campaigning. But then I think in general, just being, first of all, setting boundaries. After working on multiple campaigns now, I will go into a campaign setting better boundaries for myself, and like knowing, you know, that it's okay to ask for a day off or take some time off to take care of yourself, because if you're not in good mental or spiritual or physical health, then you're not going to do a good job, you know. And so you know, I'm like kind of a, you know, very hardworking person. And sometimes it's a curse because I feel guilty for taking time off if other people are working. But you just have to not do that. Like you have to, you know, understand like it's okay to take time off for yourself, for your own personal, mental and physical health. And then acknowledging that you can't do everything. And this is something that I have had a hard time dealing with my entire life. Is I always want to do everything and you just physically can't. And so figuring out where you can have the most impact, where you can make the most impact, like, you know, there are so many things that we all care about, so many issues to get involved with, like where can I make the most impact? And which is why I'm like interested in organizing, you know, doing progressive outreach to the Chinese community, because I feel like there are, you know, only so many people who are in a position to do that. And it's work that really needs to be done. So, and, you know, there's other things like, you know, the ADEM elections where I feel like a lot of people can get involved in that. And there are other people doing that outreach. And, but, you know, for outreaching to the API community as a progressive, I feel like that work hasn't been done enough. So, you know, so figuring out like where you can make the most impact, and just, you know, figuring out what makes you happy too. Because if you enjoy the work, then you're going to be able to sustain and keep doing it, and avoid burnout, because sometimes there's work that you're good at that you don't necessarily like, and there's work that that, you know, actually brings you fulfillment.
Right.
And so it's important to do the work that brings you fulfillment. And it's hard, like, because in progressive politics and organizing, like, you deal with people and people can be nasty to each other sometimes, you know.
Sometimes?
A lot of times. And so navigating through the drama and all of that, like, it's hard.
Yeah, and I know Jiang is probably going to have a lot to say about that, but I will say that, Claire, that what you've just mentioned in terms of, you know, doing what makes you happy and not trying to force yourself into situations where, you know, you don't take breaks for your mental health and your own physical well-being. I think those are general life advice that is very important. I mean, honestly, I'm just thinking it applies to my work at, you know, UCLA. It also applies to anything that you like really will do as an activist. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
And actually, one more thing I'll add that I've kind of come to discover through, well, the Bernie campaign, is if you are in a leadership position, you have the power to set the tone of the space that you're running. And I was very intentional by the time I got to the Bernie campaign, because I, organizing this, Berniecrats spaces, working on other campaigns, I was very intentional in creating a very positive, collaborative, inclusive space that really welcomed feedback and that valued each individual that, came to the space and not just saw them as like workers to produce calls and numbers.
Right.
And so, if you get to a position where you're leading a group, a meeting, it's really important to set the right tone, the positive tone that enables the community to continue building.
Yeah, and I will totally echo that because I've known Rapi Castillo. He's worked on AOC's campaign, Alexander Ocasio-Cortez in New York as the tech person there, and he basically said that same thing, Claire, that her campaign was welcoming, open to all, like, each volunteer using their own skills really drive the whole election for her forward. And so I think that's really a key for the grassroots, but that's just my personal perspective.
Yeah, and I totally echo the sentiments you both are expressing. I'm seeing in various spaces, in workplaces and in nonprofits, that some of them are very top down.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
And it really inhibits growth.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And it inhibits the ability to serve appropriately and maximizing the potential of the services. And so, yeah, it and really the things that we have to do require so much creativity, imagination, and really a change from what we have been doing, that we can't dismiss what the older generations have contributed and what they know, but we have to create room for younger folks who have new ideas because we need them.
Yeah,
like
Absolutely.
like status quo, what we've done in the past, it's over. Like, we have to pave a new path. And there are just a lot of people, in even nonprofit spaces, that really resist giving up that kind of clout and power.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
Could not agree more.
I mean, that's why I think, Claire, as a leadership position that you've played on the campaign, I think that's why I've said in the past that, you do have that kind of openness that does, like, I wasn't even on the 2020 campaign, and you just mentioned I think, core principles of being a good leader.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, people think of leadership like, oh, whoever is like speaks the loudest,
Mm-hmm.
is like a strong, like make decisions, unwavering, whatever.
Yeah.
But I found that, a good leader really needs to be a good listener and needs to bring people together, and unfortunately I feel like there aren't enough,
Mm-hmm.
spaces where that kind of leadership is happening right now.
It goes to Gion's point of power. Go ahead, Gion.
Well, yeah, and in our own cultures, at least speaking for Korean culture, you really have to defer to your elders and even to men.
Yep.
And so the kinds of spaces that we actually need are new kinds of spaces,
Mm-hmm.
and new kinds of dynamics. And I love seeing them come into fruition. So I love it so much. And, like, I think when I was younger, I like flouted patriarchy and like ageism and all that kind of stuff, like, just out of rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
But now I just see how necessary it all is, and people are actually interacting in new ways that are very inspiring and hopeful for me.
Yeah, no, I think similar for most AAPI communities, we have that those old culture, and I think, Claire, you touched upon it when you said, like, if you mention the words like socialism or communism, people are like, what are you saying, like, in these communities. And it's really, how do you break down those kind of barriers of kind of resistance to make those changes to the patriarchy and just these, I would say, systems of power and oppression almost. Like, I mean, it echoes the whole Black Lives Matter movement of like, these are ingrained culturally for one reason or another. And, how do we identify and how do we move past them is kind of our job as progressives, I think.
Yep.
So, yeah.
I'd like to know, though, as somebody who has struggled with setting boundaries, what specific boundaries did you set
That's
when
a
you were
good
going
point.
into your last campaign?
I will say that I had a hard time during the Bernie campaign. I was just working nonstop. I after the Bernie campaign, actually worked on the No on Prop 22 campaign, which was fighting Uber and Lyft's ballot measure to basically undermine workers' rights, employee rights. And so going into that one, I was like, okay, I am actually going to take weekends off. I'm going to figure out like where I need to put my efforts into. And it was a little different. Like with the Bernie campaign, because I was in a leadership position, it was harder to let go. I shouldn't say to let go. I should say like I felt like the responsibility in ensuring that everything was happening. And I was also seeing my team work their asses off and not that I was like making them. I was actually constantly reminding them to take breaks and go to bed and figuring out ways to get, volunteers to do the work that, that they would otherwise be doing. But just recognizing that like, okay, I really need to just like go eat right now. Like not, this is not super urgent. I can go take a break, go eat. And then, by the time I was on the No on Prop 22 campaign, I was definitely like, okay, I'm taking weekends off. I'm making plans with my husband. I am not, even though there were some presentations that popped up that, groups were asking the campaign to do, I was like, it's our anniversary. I'm not going to do it. Like there are, two other people who can do it. Like, I don't have to be the person doing this, So just being able to also prioritize like family, well-being, all of that. And I think like if I were ever to get into another campaign, and I will also say, I'd also try to make sure that my staff had boundaries. So during our, like we had weekly staff meetings, and during the staff meeting, I wanted to make sure that we went over everyone's schedule for the day off that they would be taking that week and make sure that they have like time off. That's really important. But I think, in the future, if I ever go back to another campaign, I think I would go into it being like, okay, I need a day off, a week. Like I can't not take a day off. And like during the Bernie campaign, because I was considered management, I really like didn't have a day off ever. But I think if I were ever to take another campaign, I would just put that like up front, like I need a day off a week. Like it's really important for my mental and physical health.
I have a question about what you've been doing. So it sounds like you've been involved a lot in electoralism. And you spoke about how people best serve progressivism and serving people. So going forward, will you continue to be involved in electoralism as opposed to, say, direct action? Or will you take a break? Or what are you going to do?
It's a hard question. I don't really know exactly. Like, I never planned to be in politics. Since I was in first grade, I knew I wanted to be an artist and a teacher. And for a really long time, I was an artist and a teacher. I will say, I kind of like fell into like electoral politics, and I don't really know. Like in the immediate future, I want to try to figure out how to organize, have progressive outreach to the Chinese community in San Francisco. Like that's kind of what I'm most interested in right now. I'm also just doing a lot more reading about. I feel like I'm in a kind of strange space of being a leftist, but also having worked on, been part of democracy movements in Hong Kong, and this weird space of, I support, socialist ideology, and I also feel that democracy is really important, and just kind of reading up and because I feel like there's also this tendency in the left to not be as critical as we should be on some of the past communist and socialist regimes that have happened. And so that's just like, personally, I'm just wanting to. I have been reading more and figuring out how to articulate these things, and reimagine, and actually, like, what do we want things to look like as leftists? Because as we talked about, this patriarchal top-down system doesn't work, and it's been most of the regimes we've seen, and a lot of the ones that have failed have used this kind of system, and I don't think that that's the way to go. So like, how do we reimagine what kind of society we want to create, if we were able to create one. And so to answer your question in terms of electoral politics, I don't really know. Like, I think I have some skills, but thankfully there aren't immediate elections happening in San Francisco in the near future. So I'm basically gonna like not think about it for a little bit and just kind of focus on these other things. I'm very excited about Nina Turner running for Congress. I'm not gonna go to Ohio because I don't know anything about Ohio. But yeah.
That's so funny that you talk about what you're studying right now, because I definitely also kind of have issues with people just looking to European male theorists, and talking about them as if they have the answers, all the answers. And it's like, no, like we have to forge our own, like a new kind of reality based on like the circumstances that we have now, which are very different from the circumstances that existed then. And so I am more interested in things that like Ruth Wilson Gilmore has to say about racial capitalism, which I find to be like critiques. But she also talks about abolition. But like, yeah, I mean, what does a just and an equitable future require? That's not just based on like what dead European white men have said.
I have two comments. One, I totally agree with both you and Claire on that. Like, we as leftists need to really understand critical views on how the ideal system that we envision looks like, and who it takes care of, and all of these kind of really important social change that needs to occur. Because like I feel like a lot of times people that are doing direct action to support others and things like that, they may not have that complete focus of like, okay, where are we trying to get to? Because we're all just trying to patch the leaking boat and we don't know where the boat's going, but we're just trying to patch it, right? It's kind of like the $2,000 stimulus thing. We don't know, but we just want to make sure that, we can float. So, I mean, Claire, it's very important that I think, one way to, like you're saying, is to read up on what, different people have said and how do we move from that. And my next question or comment is to Claire, actually. What have you been reading and what do you suggest to people? If you have, if you'd want to.
I don't really know if I have a clear like suggestions of a reading list yet, because I'm really compiling it myself. But I've been reading more about China under Mao, because it's connected to my family history, right. And I started reading it mostly because I wanted to understand. Just from growing up in Hong Kong, I know bits and pieces, but I didn't really have like a comprehensive, detailed understanding of all of the policies and the consequences of all of these different policies. And I know that in the West there's like this demonization of Mao, but also then in leftist circles there is this glorification of Mao. Yep. And I really want to understand like exactly, what were the policies, what were the consequences of these policies, the intended consequences and unintended consequences. And so currently I am reading, let me pull it up. China Under Mao by Andrew Walder. And it goes into like a lot of detail into all of the different policies from, land reform in rural areas to urban areas to, the different stages from the initial revolution to the Civil War and everything that happened. And there are like lots of misconceptions out there of what happened. And so it's just been really fascinating for me, and just to understand like, where, and throughout the process, I try to use a critical lens into seeing like, okay, this is, I agree with this. Okay, this is maybe a little bloodier than I want it to be, but I think that it still kind of achieved the purpose. And then like, oh, here, I think it's like way out of control. Like, we're just extracting false confessions through torture and executing people. Like that is, doesn't work, so just really diving in. And a lot of the campaigns last only a few years. And, he had a lot of different policy changes throughout his tenure. So, figuring out like what were all those things and what were the consequences of each of those.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point in terms of trying to figure out what is a story, right? Because a lot of times the history is misconstrued, and like having that critical lens is very important. And I usually teach a workshop at UCLA on critical cartography because my background is mapping, and the person I teach it with, she's a indigenous person, and we always talk about how it's not the Western centered ideas of knowing that are always correct, and they oftentimes invalidate and disempower like female voices and voices of color and all these other like maybe I would say competing ideas of knowledge production. And these are important ways to really talk to people that may not agree.
Do you see any connections in Hong Kong and what's happening here?
I actually started seeing connections between the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong and the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2014. I was seeing a lot of connections with people being on the streets fighting a system and structure that is unjust. And, a big part, even though the protests in Hong Kong started with something different that they were protesting about. Very quickly, it also became a anti-police violence movement because the state uses the police force to reinforce this oppressive system. And the police is designed to just blindly follow these orders. And so, people were out there to protest an unjust system. They were out there to protest police violence. And for the most part, actually, when people were left alone, the protests would be really peaceful and positive. But then as soon as, police shows up with riot gear and tear gas, things get messy. And I was seeing like a ton of the parallels and just how the police was treating its own people as the enemy. It was like really disheartening. And so there was, the first wave in 2014 and then another wave in 2019 to go into 2020. And I was just seeing like a lot of connections between what was happening there in Hong Kong and here in the US. I'm just very saddened by how things have developed in Hong Kong recently. And so it gives me less hope for Hong Kong. Whereas I feel like here, there's still a fight to be had. Mm-hmm. And we've seen like shifts in the conversations. This second wave of Black Lives Matter movements. I think we've seen a shift in the national conversation around it. So I think that's positive.
I mean, it's interesting too because in Thailand, both in 2010 and to some extent in 2020, it's the same idea of protesters being peacefully protesting, but then the military. Because I mean, in Thailand, the ties between the political leaders and the military are like super entwined. That peaceful protests being met with riot gear police, and maybe there is some CIA whatever stuff going in there in Thailand in particular, but I just definitely feel like, regardless, it's Thai people in military gear cracking down.
Well, with regards to what's happening in Hong Kong, sometimes people are like, actually, the Chinese government says like, oh, these people are on the streets because of, the influence from the West, American foreign influence, blah, blah. I'm please, they're, of a city of, 7.5 million people, 2 million people were out on the streets. Like, people were there because they wanted to fight for something, they believed in something.
Yep.
But then, it's complicated because I feel like there's some kind of confusion of democracy that has to be a Western influence thing. And, if you are supportive of your original culture, you reject that. And that kind of gets mingled up with capitalism. But I think that those are very separate and different things. There's the capitalist economic system, and we can be critical and reject that system, but we can also still fight for democracy as a governance system. And in Hong Kong, we found that, well, actually, with regards to the U.S., we found that the Republicans have been much more vocal about the protests in Hong Kong and kind of co-opting it and using it, as, like Marco Rubio is like, kind of one of the leading figures in speaking out about, issues in Hong Kong. And we haven't seen the left being as vocal. And so, which is why, like, I'm interested in exploring this realm too. Like, the left can be fighting against, this capitalist system, as well as fighting for democracy.
Yeah.
That's so interesting that you say that, because actually in this country, we've never really had true democracy. Our government is not set up as a true democracy. So this,
this fallacy that we have a democracy is really about an ideal that we've never achieved.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an ideal that everybody wants, regardless of what country you're in, that no country has personally know of has truly been able to manifest in their governments. So to say that it's an American thing is really not true. It's again, it's something that I think most people want, regardless of where you are.
Yeah, I think when I hear that idea, it's kind of like the conflict I usually describe between the individual versus the collective, and how do you balance those two, right? Because I mean, the other notion of Western ideals and philosophy is the individual has total free will, basically, and the idea of like the collective in like Eastern cultures, like Gian's shaking her head. What?
Yeah, it's like the breakdown of the community is so much a part of what's wrong with capitalism, with really like the Western way of living.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, going back to like being intentional, like we have to be intentional about how to build back up community.
Yeah, and that's where I think the word like social really comes into context, right? Where it's about our neighbors, it's about us as individuals, it's about us as the group within that individualism of like an AAPI, a leftist. I mean, there's all these different groups that we can all fit into, and how do we best utilize, our talents and our skills to make the changes that we need. Yeah.
So I have a question for like regular folks who have a full-time job and, maybe have a family. How can they be involved in making change? How would you tell them to get involved?
I mean, there are lots of different ways to get involved. I will say that joining an organization is probably, I think, one of the easiest ways, because then it's a little less overwhelming. Like the organization will have, its priorities and will tell you how to get involved and what to do. And, now let's do this letter writing campaign or to this, congressperson, or get involved in this particular issue, call these people. If you try to navigate it all yourself and keep up with it all yourself, it can be really overwhelming. So, joining our organization, and there are lots of different organizations out there. And I think that there is an organization for for lots of different issues and ways to get involved, and demographics, like everything from Sunrise being more youth-led, focus on the environment, to Working Families Party, to I can't really name all the organizations, but figuring out what draws you in, and where your interests are. And I think that's like the easiest way to plug in.
Yeah, is there a resource, or maybe we can compile a resource for listeners to really check in locally, or across different maybe even countries?
Yeah, and actually the other thing too is like getting involved locally.
Yeah,
usually is you will be able to see more immediate impacts when you get involved locally.
For
so,
sure.
If there are local organizations to get involved with, I definitely encourage that. And, the decisions that your local elected officials make are likely to have like a really direct impact on your daily life. Whereas things on a state or national level are much harder to influence. So, for starters, I'd say, try to get involved locally.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big question for that is like, how do you find these orgs? I mean, obviously you type in on the search engine and things like that. I'm lucky to have been able to, be at the right space on Twitter. That's how I get connected to people. But any suggestions for those?
It's hard to say. Like, I don't think I don't have a comprehensive list of every single type of organization.
Oh, no.
But
yeah,
like, if you're like a Bernie person, Our Revolution, it was formed after the 2016 campaign, and there are like local chapters of Our Revolution, of which the SF Berniecrats is one. So,
right.
Like and we actually, SF Berniecrats was formed before the official national Our Revolution was formed.
What? That's awesome.
But we are like a, now a local chapter.
Yeah.
So, if you're in San Francisco, I'd say, definitely feel free to join. There are if you go to our Revolution's website, there will be listings of all the local chapters. There's also DSA, there's Sunrise. A lot of these organizations are national and then have local chapters. So, those could be starting points. And then there's like down to like neighborhood levels. There, different in San Francisco, different Democratic club, like the Richmond District Democratic Club, and blah, blah. But, those you might need to do a little more research as to like what their political leanings are, because they can vary.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a really good way to summarize it. So going from the national organizations down to local, rather than, starting away trying to figure out, by yourself what the local orgs are. So thanks, Claire, for plugging that in.
Okay. So just real quick, like I literally just had a friend of mine say, all these posts about Black and brown folks, like, what about us Asians? Like, why are we always left out of the conversation? What would you say to that?
Actually, I was thinking about the different roles that the API community can play, and I wasn't going to mention it because we are already like really over time.
Okay.
But
yeah.
But I think that, first of all, even though Asians do have a history of discrimination in this country, I would say that, we've faced discrimination in this country stemming from, the Chinese Exclusion Act. I think that compared to the Black population, people who came here actually decided to come here themselves. And even though the system had been against us, we didn't face the same level of oppression that Africans had faced, because they came here in chains. They never wanted to come here. And then the system consistently, until this day, treated them as... The system just tried to push them down as much as possible. Now, the Asian community in San Francisco organized, over, a really long period of time, and at this point is able to become like an organizing bloc. And that took a lot of work, and it was difficult. But that bloc was able to more or less be formed. Of course, it's not, monolithic. But the system has made it extremely, extremely difficult for African Americans to organize throughout history, and has consistently tried to dismantle any organizing. And I think, and I've actually kind of developed this realization throughout my last few years of organizing, that I think Asian Americans are in a unique position where we understand, to some extent, I think we have a better understanding of the struggles of communities of color, because we kind of experience it, maybe not to the same extent as, Black and brown folks. But we do have that understanding of privilege. Mm-hmm. And we have this social position, I guess, for lack of a better word, of like being, having some voice in society and you know, being listened to and being more or less respected in a certain way, that I think we're in a unique position to bridge that. It's just hard to say bridge the misunderstanding, because that's like, you know, it's a difficult task, but you know, I've made attempts, and I think I've seen other people make attempts to, you know, try to bring both sides to the conversation and help each other understand each other's perspective, because I think we're like in this unique position to kind of be able to understand or at least, you know, connect to both.
That's kind of what happened in LA during the Watts riots, right? Korean community versus the African American community at the time. They were coming at it from different angles, but you know, at the end of the day, the conversation, I think, of bringing both groups into the fold underscores that need to like bridge that gap.
Do you mean the 92 riot?
Yeah, the 92 riots. Yeah.
Or uprising, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely lived through it, and my own parents were Republicans because of like all the tax reasons and whatnot. And Reagan, for whatever reason, was very popular amongst Koreans. And then when the uprising happened and Daryl Gates, the police chief, did not protect K-Town,
Yeah.
A lot of Koreans en masse became Democrats. So yeah, I definitely I have definitely seen how Koreans in LA had the realization, oh, we're really not treated like white folks are. But then there are, you know, there are like this friend of mine is like, my friend's father was killed during that uprising. Like we're victims too. Why is all the attention on Black and brown folks?
Right. I mean, and it goes back to Claire's point. Like, I really love the notion of the false dichotomy that she mentioned. It's why is it us, not them? That's the dangers, I think, of that kind of just thinking in terms of those boxes and not being able to like go beyond that. So, yeah.
Well, what I also tried to inartfully explain to this friend is that because Black folks in this country have been systematically oppressed, if our systems are changed so that they are no longer oppressed, then that is naturally going to equalize, or at least not equalize, but make things more fair for everyone. But this was all over text, and that point didn't get across very well.
Well, at least you mentioned it here.
One thing I learned from the No on Prop 22 campaign is that you can't really just rely on text on really complicated issues. It's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, because I mean, honestly, Claire, that campaign had to have been done digitally, right? I mean,
yeah,
the COVID
we sent out like over 12 million texts, but it was such a complicated issue that I felt like we just had to have those longer conversations with people.
Yep.
Totally.
And the sad thing too is like the people that were, actually Lyft and Uber drivers, they basically were getting propagandized from their own employers.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So it was.
That's like a whole other.
Yeah. I mean, I deleted like Lyft from my phone and Instacart. I was like, screw y'all, forget you, Grubhub, gone. Yeah. Like after it passed.
I couldn't bring myself to ever use any of these apps again.
Yeah.
Since then.
So
I come from labor. I just came out of a 6-year stint with an SEIU local. So, you know, that
Is it
Prop 22.
721?
No, I was at 1,000, which is
Okay.
state workers. And so, yeah, seeing Prop 22 was really a bummer.
Yeah, and I mean that's why I'm so excited in the episode with Natalie Matsuoka, and Claire, I mentioned to you about this too, that we are releasing a report on California Asians and how they voted completely for Prop 22. It was insane.
But there was so much disinformation, intentional disinformation.
Mm-hmm. And I think as us, like, you know, being here, we can help to like fight back. But I mean, Claire, you sent how many text messages? And
we basically sent at least one text to every single California voter who had a cell phone in the voter file.
Wow.
That's incredible.
That's amazing.
But the thing is, it's such a complicated issue and there was so much misinformation that it was really hard to fight that. You know, you really need a more in-depth conversation. It's not something that you can do, you know, with a 30-second ad or, you know, a text.
Or like really discussion, I mean, somewhere in the media or something.
Well, and that's the thing. I realized that like in San Francisco, in like downtown LA, Prop 22 lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
it did.
In areas where there was a history of organizing, a lot of discourse, political discourse happening, the proposition lost because, like, for example, in San Francisco, you know, there are tons of different clubs, and the vast majority of the clubs endorsed no on Prop 22 and had an explainer in them. And, you know, it lost by, you know, I think over 60% of people voted no in San Francisco, but the rest of the state isn't as organized, doesn't have as much organizing to counter the disinformation. And so, I mean, I went to like a ton of different presentations. Like every week I would go to speak with multiple organizations about Prop 22. And I feel like when they heard me speak, they really understood the issues. But I'd say, I don't know, like 80% of the organizations I spoke to were in San Francisco.
I was going to say that. And how do we get people outside of SF and LA in the middle of California, right? Like Bakersfield, Fresno. Like, how do we actually start to help build out the AAPI or even just progressive efforts there? Because honestly, it's very important that, I mean, what you said, it's like most of our organizations, organizing takes place in these places. And so any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think just as with API, the API community, I think the organizing just has to happen consistently and not only during election cycles. And once you build the organizations, the relationships, you know, then it becomes a lot easier to you know, rally people up during election cycles. But if you just go in during the election cycle, then it's too late.
Which is really the case for all the mutual aid that's going on right now.
Yep.
What do you mean? Like building those networks, Jiyoung, or?
Yeah. It's really, I think, the basis of grassroots organizing.
Yeah. So, okay. We have quite a bit of content. And yeah, Jiyoung, would you like to recap the episode a little bit?
I think you should do it.
Well, so the episode, we really talked about how Claire started the SF Berniecrats. Who is the other co-founder?
My husband. Because we had started like the Burn Baby Burn parties together.
Gotcha.
And then we co-founded the SF Berniecrats. He's a bit burnt out, so I'm more involved than he is these days.
Gotcha. Actually, I on the Burn Baby Burn, I was in LA at the time, so my mom attended a couple of those with her aunt, with my aunt.
Nice.
And she did
that
donate.
Is so cute. That is super cute.
So she enjoyed it. And she's like, you know, in her 60s, 50s or something. So it was good. I mean, it really
was she out on the dance floor?
Yeah. I mean, she loves
Oh my
disco,
gosh.
and
That is so cute.
so yeah, shout out to the Burn Baby Burn parties. That's a really good way to really help get movement started. But yeah, so Claire really mentioned about how, just to get started with being an activist, and we covered a lot of things regarding how political movements are structured, and I think the most important thing that we've mentioned too was how to be critical while also maintaining that focus. If you're in a leadership position, allowing the people with you to kind of grow out their talents in the way that allows people to just be themselves and build on their talents. And we also talked a little bit more on just social movements around the world. So Hong Kong was one, how that ties in with Black Lives Matter here in the US. We also discussed at length kind of work-life balance, making sure you have time to recharge and setting boundaries. Yeah, so I think that's more or less the episode. We did end up going quite a bit longer, which I think is fine. Sorry, Claire, if you had other plans.
No, it's totally fine.
But yeah, I do want to really, really thank you for taking the time to come on, because as you can tell, we're just starting this podcast, but I think the ability to network and kind of get our ideas out there for people to think about and really act upon is one reason why having you on at this early stage is, I think, really impactful. And like I said in the past, you have been really inspirational in the work that you've been doing with your activism. So even though you may not be doing it now and you're reading up on a lot of these great things, but yeah, I just really glad to have been able to get this opportunity. So yeah.
I think you got it. It was just really nice to chat with you and meet you.
Yeah, it was great meeting you and seeing you both here. And thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Next week, we're going to have Kenneth Mejia come in the show to talk about his running for Los Angeles City Controller. He is a Green Party candidate. We're going to hear about how his campaign is going and just his thoughts about running as an AAPI person in Los Angeles for City Controller. And if you don't know what a City Controller is, it's basically the person who oversees the budget and kind of like accounting for the budget. Where what goes where. So things like Black Lives Matter, trying to figure out, how much money is actually going to police is like one of the things that he's kind of campaigning on and stuff. But yeah, food for thought to leave with our listeners.
I'd say that things are not, binary. Like, I think in politics, we see a lot of, people like to reduce things to a binary, black and white. And a lot of things are more nuanced. So it's important to really dive deep into the issues.
That's, yeah, I can't stress the importance of that more than like how you said it, because I mean, we get too trapped in that binary thinking that it almost kind of isolates one another. And I mean, I think media is kind of also to blame for that, in a sense that, if you're not with us, you're against us. Mm-hmm. And that really is fundamentally what undercuts a lot of the movements, I think. I mean, this notion of like, we can't include these groups of people because they don't stand with us because they voted for Trump. I mean, that type of thinking is just so, I don't know, limited. I think that I would encourage viewers and listeners to like take what Claire said and think about going beyond that binary thinking. Okay, well, thanks again. And so remember, next week we have the episode with Kenneth Mejia, and that title is "What's Up with Running for Office." So it will be on January next week, on Monday, January 11th. So check in then and have a great week. Take care.
Thank you.